I've been living in Arizona for almost half my life now. Originally, I'm from Guadalajara, a place that's still alive in my heart, even though I've gotten used to the desert heat. The move happened when I was in my early 20s, searching for something different, something quieter. Life here is steady, and teaching Spanish at a local language school is a decent way to make a living. Not exactly a childhood dream, but it works. My wife, Marisol, is the real star in our household. She's an actress, and not just any actress, a damn good one. We met back in Guadalajara, and even then she had the aura of someone destined for something bigger. When we moved to Arizona, it was for her career. I didn't mind. I figured I could teach Spanish anywhere, but her opportunities would be better in the States. And they were. She started with small roles in local theater, but over time, she caught the eye of some casting directors. Soon enough, she was landing gigs that paid well and even brought some recognition. I was proud of her, she was doing what she loved and I was happy to support her. We didn't have kids, so I figured it was easier for both of us to focus on our careers. My days were spent at the language school, working with students from all walks of life. They came in eager to learn Spanish for their jobs, travel, or sometimes just for fun. I liked the routine of it, the predictable rhythm of classes, lesson plans, and grading. Marisol's world, though, was anything but routine. She was constantly meeting new people, rehearsing at odd hours, going to auditions, and sometimes flying out of state for work. I didn't mind the late nights or the weekends when she had to work. It was part of the deal, and I was okay with it until things started to change. It wasn't overnight, but there was a shift. She became more distant, always on her phone or checking her emails, even when we were supposed to be spending time together. At first, I didn't think much of it. Actors have to stay connected, right? They never know when the next big opportunity might pop up. But then she started being late, more than usual, and not just from rehearsals. It was different. She was distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere, even when she was home. One night, she came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room, grading some papers, when I heard the door open. She walked in, looking exhausted, and dropped her bag on the floor. I glanced up from my work, giving her a smile, but she barely acknowledged me. She muttered something about a long day and went straight to the bedroom. I followed her after a few minutes, hoping to chat about our day, but she was already in bed, facing the wall. I didn't push it. We all have tough days, right? But it kept happening. She was more withdrawn, less interested in talking, and she started staying out later more frequently. I told myself it was just the stress of her work. Actors live chaotic lives, and maybe this was just a busy period. But then I started hearing things, people in the theater world talk, and I had a few friends who'd mentioned things in passing, nothing direct, just hints. They'd ask if I'd seen Marisol's new project or how I felt about her working so closely with that one actor, Lucas. It was always Lucas this, Lucas that. I'd met him a few times. A tall, handsome guy with a smooth charm and a winning smile, the kind of smile that probably won him more roles than his acting talent. I didn't think much of it at first. Marisol had worked with plenty of attractive people before, and it was never an issue. But this Lucas guy started to come up in conversations more and more. When Marisol talked about her day, Lucas's name would slip in casually, like he was a constant presence in her life. It started to bug me, but I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I trusted her, at least I thought I did. Then, one evening, she came home late again, around midnight. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep, but I wasn't. I heard her creeping in, trying not to wake me. She smelled different, like a mix of sweat and some expensive cologne that wasn't hers. I kept my eyes closed, listening to her movements, and when she finally slipped into bed, she sighed, but not in the way someone does when they're relieved to be home. It was more like she was carrying some heavy burden. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time I felt that gnawing doubt that something was seriously wrong. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't know what to say. How do you even start that conversation? Instead, I decided to keep my eyes open, to pay attention to the things I'd been ignoring or brushing off. It wasn't long before I started noticing the small but telling signs. Text messages she'd hide quickly, phone calls she'd take in another room, the way she'd suddenly perk up when her phone buzzed. A few weeks after that night, Marisol came home with some big news. She'd been cast in a new movie, a decent-sized production being filmed right here in Arizona. She was excited, genuinely excited, and for the first time in a while I saw that old spark in her eyes. She told me about the role, how it was a big break for her, how it could lead to even bigger things. I was happy for her, truly, but then she mentioned who her co-star was, Lucas. It was like a punch to the gut. I forced a smile and congratulated her, trying to push the unease down. She didn't notice my hesitation, too caught up in her excitement. She went on and on about the script, the director, how the role was challenging but perfect for her. I listened, nodding along, but my mind was elsewhere. All I could think about was Lucas, how his name had been popping up more and more in our conversations, and now they were going to be working together every day. The filming schedule was intense. They'd be on set from early morning until late at night, sometimes even overnight. Marisol told me this like it was no big deal, just part of the job, but I couldn't help but feel a cold pit in my stomach. This wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity for them to spend countless hours together, away from home, away from me. A few days into filming, Marisol started coming home even later than usual. She'd look exhausted, her makeup still on, smudged around the edges, her hair disheveled from a long day on set. But it wasn't just physical exhaustion. There was something else in her eyes, something distant, like she was somewhere else even when she was right in front of me. I asked her how things were going with the movie, and she'd always say the same thing: it's going great, just a lot of work. She'd smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to believe her, to think that everything was fine, but the nagging feeling in my gut kept growing. One evening she came home around midnight looking more worn out than usual. I was sitting on the couch flipping through channels on the TV, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that had been plaguing me all day. When she walked in, I turned the TV off and looked at her, waiting for her to say something. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed into the armchair across from me. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah," she sighed, rubbing her temples. "We had to reshoot a few scenes. The director wasn't happy with how they turned out the first time." I nodded, watching her closely. She looked different, more tired, more stressed. But there was something else too, a flicker of something in her eyes, something she was trying to hide. "How's Lucas?" I asked, throwing his name out there to see how she'd react. She looked up at me, a bit surprised by the question. "He's fine," she said a little too quickly. "Why?" "Just curious," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "You've been spending a lot of time with him lately." She shrugged, looking away. "We're just working. It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her body tensed up when she talked about him. There was something there, something she wasn't telling me. As the weeks went by, things only got worse. Marisol started staying out later and later, sometimes not coming home until the early hours of the morning. When I asked her about it, she'd brush it off, saying it was just work, that they were behind schedule and had to work through the night. But I didn't believe her, not anymore. I knew something was going on, but I didn't have any proof, nothing concrete. Just a gut feeling that was getting harder and harder to ignore. I started paying closer attention to her, noticing the little things, the way she'd smile at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she'd get defensive whenever I mentioned Lucas. One night, I decided to go to the set. I told myself it was just to surprise her, to show support, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. When I got there, the place was buzzing with activity. Crew members were running around, setting up lights and cameras, while the director barked orders from his chair. I found Marisol in her trailer getting ready for the next scene. She looked startled when she saw me, like she wasn't expecting me to show up. "Sebastian, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and something else, maybe irritation. "I wanted to see you in action," I said with a smile, trying to keep things light. "I thought it'd be fun to watch you work." She forced a smile and nodded, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled about me being there. We chatted for a few minutes, but there was a tension in the air, something unspoken between us. Then, Lucas walked in. He was all smiles, greeting Marisol like they were the best of friends, or maybe more. He glanced at me, his smile never faltering, but there was something behind his eyes, something smug. I shook his hand, trying to gauge him, but he was as smooth as ever, charming, confident, and completely at ease. They were called to set shortly after, and I followed them, standing off to the side as they prepared to shoot the scene. It was a romantic scene, of course, with Marisol and Lucas playing lovers. I watched as they got into character, the way they looked at each other, the way they touched. It was all acting, I knew that, but it felt too real, too intimate. When the director yelled cut, they stayed close, laughing together, whispering something I couldn't hear. My stomach turned as I watched them, and I realized that my worst fears were probably true. That night, when Marisol came home, I didn't say much. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. After that night on set, things between Marisol and me grew colder. She was gone more often than she was home, and when she was around, it felt like I was living with a stranger. We'd sit in the same room, barely speaking, the silence heavy and thick. I started to dread the moments when she'd walk through the door because I knew she'd be exhausted, distracted, or worst of all, pretending everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. One evening she came home late again. It was well past midnight, and I was up, unable to sleep, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching anything. When she finally walked in, she looked surprised to see me awake. "Long day?" I asked, my voice betraying nothing. "Yeah, they pushed us hard today," she replied, avoiding my eyes as she kicked off her shoes. "I'm just going to shower and head to bed." I nodded, watching her as she walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't keep doing this, waiting, wondering, second-guessing everything she said. The next day I decided to go back to the set, but this time I wasn't there to support her. I was there to catch her. I told myself that if I could just see it with my own eyes, I'd know what to do next. I showed up in the late afternoon, hanging around the edges of the set where the crew was busy preparing for the evening shoot. I kept my distance, staying out of sight as I watched the hustle and bustle of the production. Marisol was nowhere to be seen, but I knew where to find her. I'd been there before, seen her trailer tucked away at the edge of the lot, out of sight from the main set. I made my way over, moving quietly between the trailers, hoping to stay unnoticed. The closer I got, the more my heart pounded in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend everything was fine, to keep living in ignorance. But another part of me, the part that had been gnawing at me for weeks, pushed me forward. When I reached her trailer, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to see inside without being seen. I peered through the crack, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There they were, Marisol and Lucas, tangled together on the small bed, their clothes strewn across the floor. They were both naked, wrapped up in each other, completely oblivious to the world outside. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was like a punch to the gut, all the air knocked out of me in one brutal blow. For a moment, all I could do was stare, my mind reeling, trying to process what I was seeing. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was in there with another man, doing things that were meant to be ours alone. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the realization that she had been lying to me for who knows how long, pretending to be someone she clearly wasn't anymore. I wanted to burst in there, to drag him off her, to scream and shout and make them pay for what they were doing to me. But I didn't. The logical part of my brain took over, reminding me that this was a movie set, that there were security guards and crew members all over the place. If I caused a scene, it wouldn't just be embarrassing for Marisol, it would ruin her career. And as much as I hated what she was doing, I couldn't bring myself to destroy her like that. Not yet, anyway. So I stepped back, carefully and quietly, and slipped away from the trailer without making a sound. My heart was pounding in my ears, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and devastation. I made my way back to the parking lot, my mind spinning with thoughts of what to do next. The reality of the situation had finally hit me, and there was no going back now. I had to figure out my next move. I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the road in front of me. When I got back, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the dashboard, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. I had never felt so betrayed, so completely and utterly alone. But I knew I couldn't let it consume me, not yet. I needed to be smart about this, I needed to plan. When Marisol finally came home later that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a beer and staring at nothing in particular. She walked in looking just as exhausted as before, maybe more. She gave me a tired smile, one that made my stomach turn, knowing what she had just been doing. "Hey," she said softly. "You're up late." "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice even, just couldn't sleep. She nodded, not noticing the tension in my voice. She mumbled something about taking a shower, and I just nodded, watching her as she walked down the hall to our bedroom. As soon as she was out of sight, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't something I could ignore or pretend away. There was no point confronting her directly. She'd lie, she'd cry, she'd make excuses, and I didn't have the stomach for any of it. Instead, I started planning my exit. I didn't want to be the guy who just walked away quietly, though. I wanted her to feel a fraction of what I was feeling. A month seemed like the right amount of time to get everything in order. One morning, when Marisol was getting ready for another day on set, I noticed her usual bottle of shampoo sitting on the bathroom counter. That's when the idea hit me. She loved her chestnut hair, always taking great care of it, and the movie she was filming required her to keep it that exact shade. I remembered there was some old hair dye stored under the sink, a bright, obnoxious pink. The kind you'd never imagine her wearing, especially not in the serious role she was playing. Perfect. She left for work, and I wasted no time. I carefully poured out her shampoo and replaced it with the pink dye. It wasn't a simple switch, but one that couldn't be reversed easily. This stuff was permanent. Even if she tried to dye over it, it wouldn't cover the pink entirely, it would just turn into some horrid mix of colors. And with the tight filming schedule, there was no way they'd have time to fix it. I put the bottle back exactly where it had been, double-checking to make sure everything looked normal. Then I waited. The next morning I could hear her in the shower, humming to herself like nothing was wrong. I was in the kitchen, pretending to read the paper, but my mind was fully on what was happening upstairs. The minutes ticked by, and I knew she'd be drying her hair soon. Then I heard a sharp gasp, followed by a string of curses. I couldn't help but smile. She came flying down the stairs, wrapped in a towel, her wet hair a shocking pink mess. The look on her face was priceless panic mixed with sheer disbelief. "Sebastian, what the hell happened to my hair?" she screamed, clutching at the ends like she could somehow shake the color out. I looked up from my coffee, feigning surprise. "I don't know, Marisol, maybe you bought the wrong shampoo." She stared at me, wild-eyed, before running back upstairs to try and fix it. But it was too late. I knew she'd be in that bathroom for hours, trying everything she could think of, and none of it would work. I left for work before she came back down, but I could imagine her frantically calling the set, telling them about the disaster. I knew it would throw a wrench into their filming schedule. If there was one thing the director couldn't afford, it was delays, and Marisol showing up with pink hair was a huge one. When I got home that evening, she was sitting on the couch, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't look at me when I walked in, just stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. "They're pissed," she said flatly. "The director's talking about recasting." I shrugged, hanging my jacket by the door. "That's too bad." She glared at me, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. I just went about my evening like nothing was wrong, knowing that her world was starting to unravel. As the days passed, I kept my distance. Marisol was in damage control mode, trying desperately to salvage her role in the film, but the pink hair had thrown everything off course. The stress was getting to her. She was on the phone constantly, talking to her agent, the director, anyone who would listen, but there was no quick fix. The dye was too stubborn, and the production couldn't afford the time to wait for her hair to be back to normal. While she was dealing with that mess, I started planning for the future. I'd had enough of Arizona, enough of her, enough of everything. When this was over, I'd go back to Guadalajara. My parents were still there, and I could always find a job teaching English. It wouldn't be hard. I knew the language, had the experience, and could slip back into life there without any trouble. It seemed like the best way to move on. I started looking into the logistics, what I'd need to do to get a divorce, how to untangle our finances, and how to make sure I left with what was mine. I wanted to be smart about it, not give her any room to come after me later. I didn't want to be tied to her in any way once I left. The thought of being free from all this was the only thing keeping me going. At night, while she tossed and turned, worrying about her career, I was mapping out my exit. I didn't tell her anything, didn't let on that I was already halfway out the door. She was too wrapped up in her own problems to notice anyway. With everything ready to file for divorce, I started feeling the weight of what I was about to do. It wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about making sure Marisol felt the consequences of her actions. I wanted her to suffer, to lose everything she'd built up, just like she had destroyed what we had. It was probably reckless, maybe even stupid, but I couldn't shake the thought. One night, while lying in bed, I remembered hearing about a group of scammers that operated under the radar, pulling off elaborate cons and never getting caught. They were infamous for robbing people blind, siphoning off fortunes, and disappearing without a trace. The idea started as a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew louder until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I began searching online, using the dark web, forums, and encrypted chat rooms, trying to find a way to contact them. It wasn't easy, but after a few weeks of digging, I found someone who could connect me with them. I reached out, careful to use anonymous channels, making sure nothing could be traced back to me. After a few days, I got a response. A simple message, "We're listening." It was eerie how fast they responded, and a part of me almost backed out. But I was in too deep, and I wasn't about to let Marisol get away with what she'd done. I laid out my plan in a series of encrypted messages. I told them about Marisol, her impressive savings, and how she was vulnerable. I painted the picture of a successful actress with a lot to lose and assured them that I didn't want a cut. This wasn't about money for me. I had enough from my teaching job to live comfortably. This was about justice, or maybe just plain old revenge. They were skeptical at first. People usually wanted something in return, But I convinced them that my motive was pure spite. They liked that it seemed to align with their way of thinking. After some back and forth, they agreed to move forward. I didn't know much about them, and I didn't ask. The less I knew, the safer I was. All I knew was that they were good, so good that they'd never been caught. The plan was simple but effective. They'd approach her under the guise of an investment opportunity, something exclusive, something she couldn't resist. Marisol had always been savvy with her money, but she also loved the idea of being in on something big, something that would set her apart from the rest. They'd make sure she thought it was legitimate, that it was too good to pass up. Once she was in, they'd bleed her dry. As the preparations began, I kept playing the role of the oblivious husband, going about my day, working at the language school, coming home to a wife who was barely there anymore. Marisol was still reeling from the pink hair disaster, and her career was on the ropes. The director had nearly replaced her, but she managed to hang on by a thread. She was desperate for something to go right, which made her the perfect target. I kept track of their progress through encrypted updates. The scammers were meticulous, setting everything up with precision. They started by planting the seeds, small hints and whispers about a big opportunity. Then they had a well-dressed man approach her at an industry event, someone who seemed credible and connected, someone who'd make her feel special. He talked about an investment in a new tech startup, one that was about to take off. Marisol, with her usual flair for networking, took the bait. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a mix of satisfaction and anxiety churning in my gut. Part of me was worried. If this went wrong, if they were exposed, there was a chance it could blow back on me. But I'd been careful, and as far as I knew, these guys had never been caught. They were professionals, and I trusted them to handle it. Weeks went by, and Marisol started talking about the investment at home, excited about the potential returns. She showed me some of the paperwork, talking about how this could be her big break outside of acting. I played along, acting supportive, pretending I believed in it as much as she did. Meanwhile, I was counting down the days until she handed over the bulk of her savings. When the day finally came, I knew it before she even told me. There was a different kind of tension in the air when she walked through the door that evening. She was jittery, but not in a bad way. More like she was thrilled, like she'd just done something huge. I did it, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. I made the investment. I smiled, masking the storm of emotions underneath. That's great, Marisol. I'm sure it's going to pay off. She nodded, practically glowing with pride. She had no idea what was coming. As she went on about the details, I sat back, letting her words wash over me, knowing that the money was already gone. The scammers would take it, vanish into thin air, and leave her with nothing. By the time she realized it was a con, it would be too late. There'd be no way to trace it back, no way to recover what she'd lost. But there was a catch. If they were caught, if the authorities got involved, there was a slim chance they could trace the setup back to me. It was a risk, but I'd come this far, and there was no turning back now. I had to trust that they'd cover their tracks, that they were as good as their reputation suggested. With the scam in motion, I began finalizing my plans. I contacted a lawyer discreetly, ready to file for divorce as soon as the dust settled. I'd be heading back to Guadalajara once it was done, back to a life that made sense, where I could teach English at some language school and leave all of this behind. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning without any grand speeches or dramatic confrontations. I walked into the kitchen, where Marisol was sipping her coffee, and handed her the papers. She looked up at me, her eyes widening in surprise. "Sebastian, what is this?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "It's what it looks like," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I'm filing for divorce." She blinked, staring at the papers like they were in a foreign language. "But why? What happened?" I didn't have it in me to go through the whole ordeal, to lay out every detail of her betrayal. There was no point. It was all over, and I was ready to move on. "You can't trust someone who lies to your face," I said simply. "That's all there is to it." Marisol tried to protest, her voice rising as she sputtered out half-formed excuses and denials. But I wasn't interested in hearing any of it. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with the papers clutched in her hands. The days that followed were tense. Marisol didn't know what to do with herself. She'd already been kicked off the film after the pink hair disaster, so she was home all the time, pacing the house, trying to talk to me, trying to make sense of what was happening. But I had nothing left to say. I was done. I bought plane tickets to Guadalajara, setting the flight for a few days later. The plan was simple: get through the divorce proceedings, pack up what I needed, and head back to a life that made sense. I didn't tell Marisol about the tickets, didn't give her any indication of when I'd be leaving. She was in the dark, just like she'd left me for so long. The day the scam went down, I could see something had changed in her. She was more frantic than usual, her phone glued to her ear, her eyes wide with panic. I knew it had happened, the money was gone, just like we'd planned. All those savings she'd worked so hard for, everything she'd built up in her career, it had all vanished into thin air. She didn't mention it to me at first, maybe out of pride or maybe because she still hadn't fully processed what had happened. But I could see it in her face, in the way she moved around the house like a ghost, barely holding it together. Later that evening, she finally broke down. I was in the living room, going through some old papers, when she burst in, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Sebastian, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. "What is it?" She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I've been scammed," she choked out. "All the money, it's gone. Everything I had saved, it's just gone." I didn't react right away. I knew this moment was coming, but seeing her like this, completely broken, stirred something inside me. It wasn't satisfaction, not really. It was more of a hollow feeling, like watching someone fall into a trap you'd set, knowing there was no escape. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my voice steady. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "You don't understand, Sebastian. I've lost everything. I don't know what to do." I could have told her then, could have laid it all out, but I didn't. There was no need, she was already suffering enough, and I didn't want to stick around to see the aftermath. "Maybe it's time to start over," I said quietly. "Maybe this is a chance to figure out what really matters." She stared at me, completely lost, as if I'd just spoken in a language she didn't understand. There was nothing left to say. I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her to grapple with the reality of what had happened. Over the next few days, I finalized my plans. I packed up what I needed, leaving most of the house untouched. It didn't matter anymore. The life we'd built was already in ruins, and I had no intention of carrying any of it with me to Guadalajara. The day before my flight, I quietly slipped the plane tickets into my bag. Marisol was a wreck, still trying to figure out how she could possibly recover from the loss. But I didn't care anymore. I was focused on what was ahead, on getting out and never looking back. When the morning of the flight arrived, I left the house without saying goodbye. Marisol was still asleep, exhausted from days of crying and panic. I walked out the door, got into my car, and drove to the airport, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. But when I got there, I found out the flight was delayed by several hours. The announcement over the intercom almost felt like a test, like something was trying to keep me in Arizona just a little longer. I could have waited at the airport, but the thought of sitting there with nothing but my own thoughts was unbearable. I decided to take one last walk around the city instead. I wandered through the streets, past places that had once meant something to me but now just felt empty. The cafe where Marisol and I used to have breakfast on weekends, the park where we'd walk hand in hand, talking about the future, none of it mattered anymore. I was just killing time, trying to let go of it all before I boarded that plane. As I turned a corner, lost in my own thoughts, I suddenly saw her, Marisol. She was standing there looking frantic, like she had been searching for something. Or someone. Our eyes met, and I could see the shock on her face. "Sebastian," she called out, rushing over to me. "What are you doing here? Why are you flying away? And what about me?" I felt a wave of irritation, but I kept it in check. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice calm. "I've already sold the car. I've cut off all my ends here. And down in Mexico, my ends are still growing. It's time for me to go." She looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and realization. "This is all you, isn't it?" she said, her voice trembling. "Really, it can't be a coincidence. When I slept with Lucas, I got pink shampoo from somewhere. And then I got caught in that scam. This can't be just bad luck." I kept my face neutral, offering a slight shrug. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Marisol." Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer. "About the scam, I've already filed a lawsuit. The laws work, Sebastian. If you're involved in this, you will be punished." I met her gaze, unflinching. "You were involved in treason, Marisol. You were punished. Fate punished you. Maybe it would be reasonable to let me go and start working on yourself." She stared at me, trying to read my expression, trying to find some crack in the armor I'd built up over the past few weeks. But there was nothing left for her to find. I was done with it all. Without waiting for a response, I turned and continued my walk, leaving her standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. I took my time, letting the city fade into the background, as I walked away from her and everything she represented. I wasn't angry anymore, just ready to move on. After a while, I headed back to the airport, feeling lighter with every step. By the time I got there, the plane was boarding and I was more than ready to leave. I sat in the terminal, watching the other passengers line up, my mind already in Guadalajara. When they called my group, I stood up, walked through the gate, and boarded the plane. I didn't look back. As the plane took off, I watched the ground fall away beneath us, and I knew that Arizona, Marisol, and everything that had happened there were behind me now. The flight to Mexico was short, much shorter than I expected. Before I knew it, the plane was descending, the familiar landscape of Guadalajara coming into view. It felt strange, like stepping back into a life I had left behind years ago. When I landed, I grabbed my bag and made my way through the airport, weaving through the crowds with a sense of purpose. My parents were waiting for me outside, and when they saw me, their faces lit up with warm smiles. They hadn't changed much, still the same comforting presence I remembered. We hugged, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. That night, we sat around the dinner table, catching up on everything we'd missed during the years I'd been away. They didn't ask too many questions about why I'd come back, and I didn't offer much in the way of explanation. They seemed to understand that I needed a fresh start, and that was enough for them. The next day, I started looking for a job. I knew teaching English would be the easiest way to get back on my feet, and it didn't take long to find a position at a local language school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and it felt good to be doing something productive again. The routine helped me settle in, and before long I fell into a comfortable rhythm. I found a small apartment not far from my parents' house. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine, and it was close enough to visit them whenever I wanted. After all the chaos in Arizona, the quiet life here felt like a blessing. I threw myself into my work, teaching students who were eager to learn, and I found a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. I hadn't heard anything from Marisol since I left, and that was fine by me. But then, one day out of the blue, I received a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. The message was brief, almost hesitant. "Sebastian, this is Lucas. I wanted to reach out and apologize for what happened with Marisol. She made a huge scandal after everything that went down, and I never meant for things to get so complicated. I'm sorry." I stared at the screen, reading the message over a few times. Was it really Lucas? It could have been, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It felt too convenient, too easy, like someone was trying to clean up a mess they didn't fully understand. Or maybe it wasn't him at all, just another trick, another lie. In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Whether it was Lucas or not, it wasn't my problem anymore. I left the message unanswered, deleting it from my phone and from my mind.